Hey, how are you, folks? Jason Horowitz. Glad to be with you here on CBSSports.com with your hitting planner for Week 23 fantasy baseball season coming to an end, at least for some of you, the playoffs starting for others. Let's bring in CBSSports.com fantasy writer Scott White to break down your hitting planner for Week 23. And Scott, just when Josh Hamilton was starting to come around, he's sidetracked with this back injury. How much of a concern is it for people who, whether they're in the playoffs or not?
Well, the most recent diagnosis is a pinched nerve in the back. It started out as back spasms. But that's the kind of injury that starts out as a day-to-day thing. Teams are always optimistic, but then it usually drags out for days, potentially even weeks. Unless Josh Hamilton returns this weekend, which there's still a chance could happen, I would not be interested in activating him in my lineup next week. I just think it's too much of a risk at this time of the season, where you can't afford to take any zeros from anybody.
It's not all bad news, though, Scott, on the injury front. Nate McLouth, Nick Johnson, they're set to return from hamstring injuries. You ready to put them in your lineups?
Well, the interesting thing about McLouth is that he was already ready to come back from the hamstring injury once, ended up re-aggravating it, had to start all over in the minor leagues. But it looks like he's ready to come back now this weekend, started his rehab, should be ready to go. He's the kind of player you want to get active right away. Still 2020 potential there. Nick Johnson, not quite as good. He actually already came back Friday. But still, anybody who gets on base as often as he does can be useful in fantasy this time of year if you have a hole in your lineup.
Yeah, the Marlins need him with that NL wildcard chase coming down to the last month here and cutting it closer on the Giants and the Rockies. All right, we've been doing a lot of NFL fantasy stuff, and with drafts going on, sleepers, busts, that's what people are looking for in their drafts. But you also need it for whether you're in the playoffs of fantasy or your last week of fantasy baseball as well. Let's start with the AL here. Who are your AL sleepers for Week 23?
Well, we start with Pat Burrell, who's had the disappointing season for the Rays. But this is kind of what he does. He did all his damage last year with the Phillies in the first half. Now he's saving it for the second half. Always a streaky player like that. Batting .290 with 6 home runs since the beginning of August. He's the type of player that once he gets rolling, he can be as good as anybody. So I think you need to take a flyer on him now. Nelson Cruz. I'm partially responsible for him being a sleeper now because I called him a bust the last 2 weeks. But he's a streaky player, getting back on track now. 3 home runs in his last 5 games. Those injury problems from earlier seem to be behind him now, so I'm ready to roll with him again. Melky Cabrera, mostly a non-factor since May, but he has multiple hits in 4 straight games, and the Yankees are returning home this week, where he tends to hit better. So, you got to get him active.
And I like Michael Kadire this week because the Twins in September always a good combination. What about your AL busts this week, Scott?
Bobby Abreu is the one we start off with here, and he's not normally the type of guy you'd sit, but lately, him and Napoli, both you see on this list, they're a couple struggling Angels right now. Also have tough matchups this week against Felix Hernandez, Gavin Floyd, John Danks, Mark Burley. Abreu especially, hitting .214 since the beginning of August, so I don't think this is the week he's going to wake up. Felix PA, right now you'd probably think he'd be on the sleeper list instead. One of the hottest players in baseball lately, 6 home runs in his last 9 games. But I actually don't think now's the time to take the chance on him just because the Orioles play 5 games. Athletics the same way. If it's a stud, like a Nick Markakis or a Brian Roberts, you probably still want to roll with them, but otherwise you want to avoid your Orioles and your Athletics. And then Marco Scutaro, starting off September 0 for 16 without a walk. He's never a bad start even when he's struggling because he does usually walk so much. But if you have other options to consider, now would be the time.
All right, Jermaine Dye's been killing the White Sox, by the way, so he's got to kill your fantasy team. He was on that list as well. NL sleepers, Brad Hopp is a guy that you're loving this week.
Yeah, I like him this week, even though he's killed fantasy owners lately. 248 since the All-Star break. Always known as a guy who does all his damage in one half of the season, be it the first half or the second half. I like him this week, though, because the Rockies face 6 right-handed pitchers, has an OPS 150 points higher against righties. Plus, the Rockies are home 4 games, which is good for all those hitters. Both of those, the righties and the being home, they were going to favor Carlos Gonzalez and Seth Smith, too. Those are deeper sleepers, but guys you want to look at this week as well. Casey McGee here, he's back in the fold for the Brewers. He was having to sit against right-handed pitchers, but the Brewers have kind of shied away from Craig Counsell lately, looking toward the future with McGee. 3 home runs in his last 4 games for a player eligible at second base. That kind of power is hard to find. Pedro Feliz is mostly on this list just because he's the only Philly I could get away with calling a sleeper. They play 8 games this week, which is good enough on its own. But 7 of those games are against the Nationals and the Mets, who just have brutal pitching staffs right now. Watch out for the Phillies.
Mets getting wins from guys that have never had wins before. All right, real quickly, Scott, give me your bust this week in the National League.
Adrian Gonzalez is the top one here. The slump's still going on for him, 224 in his last 15, and the Padres have to face Tim Lincecum, Barry Zito, a Rocky staff that's pretty good. So it depends who else you have, obviously, but I'd look at sitting him right now. Chipper Jones also in a deep slump, 136 over his last 18. Looks like age is finally catching up to him. He has to go against Chris Carpenter, Wandy Rodriguez, Roy Oswalt. Tough matchup for him there and the rest of the Braves. That's kind of also why Matt Diaz is on this list. He's kind of the Felix PA of the National League here. Was looking like a great sleeper, hitting over 500 for a stretch there. But he's due for a cool-down period now. 8 strikeouts in his last 3 games, so I think that's beginning for him.
That's almost 3 a game if you do the math there. Scott White, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
All right, folks, for more fantasy baseball, whether you're in the playoffs or finishing up your season, be sure to stay right here with CBSSports.com. For Scott White, I'm Jason Horowitz. Take care, folks.